Farmers from all over the world provide us with the food we eat. Modern farming is an industry, and today's farmers are helped by the latest machinery and scientific discoveries, as were the farmers before them. The early farmers of Dyfed were also looking for ways to do their work better. They made improvements which changed the lives of people in their own day and for life that is carried on to the present. But who were the early farmers of Dyfed? There are several ways you could find out. One place to go would be the library. There you could learn that for a long time people lived by gathering seeds and fruit, and by hunting animals that roamed in herds. They set up camp where the animals grazed, and followed the animals when they moved to new pastures. Gradually, people and animals got used to living close together. Animals became accustomed to having people nearby, and people learned a great deal from watching the animals they lived near. They learned that some animals, like cattle, sheep and goats, could be tamed and kept together. This gave a more certain supply of meat and milk. In time they also learned that the seeds of some wild plants, like wheat and barley, could be planted and harvested in one place. Not only was this more convenient, it was also more dependable, because the grain could be stored and ground into flour when it was needed. So instead of moving from place to place, people sowed their crops in one area and stayed for the growing season. This was the beginning of farming and a more settled way of life. They still used tools of stone and flint, as people had for tens of thousands of years. But now they improved those tools by grinding and polishing. So this time is called the New Stone Age, or the Neolithic. Neolithic comes from two Greek words, neos, meaning new, and lithos, meaning stone. And we use the word Neolithic to talk about the way of life of the first farmers. You could also go to a museum to find out more. There you could see the stone and flint tools these early farmers used. They needed to clear the land of trees so that they could make fields to plant their crops. You could also discover something else that they made: tombs for the dead. In rocky parts of Britain, they were made of large stones, several uprights, with another stone laid on top. This formed one or more chambers, and sometimes these chambers were covered with earth and stone to form a mound. Some mounds were round, and some were long. Archaeologists call these different kinds of monuments chambered tombs. But another way we can get close to the past is to visit the ancient sites themselves. And the museum might give you a clue as to the ones nearby. A look at an ordnance survey map can show you exactly where to go. Look for the words burial chamber. The Dyfed Archaeological Trust can also tell you where to find these chambered tombs. They have computerized records of over 20,000 ancient sites in the county. and have plotted them all on maps. When you get there, take time to look carefully. Remember, people deliberately chose these spots. Try to imagine yourself back in time. Try to imagine building one of these monuments in this particular place. Here are some other things to look for. We'll be finding out more about them later. How many uprights are there? Do all the uprights touch the capstone? How large is the chamber? Are there other large stones outside the chamber, forming a semicircle? Do all the stones have the same texture?
Well, they didn't dig a hole. What would the first thing you do on a floor?
Look at the burial chamber from a distance. Look at the view from the tomb. It may have marked a group's territory or grazing land. Remember, the chamber may have been covered with a mound of earth and stones, or it may have been left bare. People have been visiting chambered tombs for hundreds of years. They have drawn them and described them. One group even went so far as to see how many people on horseback could fit in the chamber of the tomb, called Pentre Ivan. Pupils at Newport Primary School also visited some chambered tombs as part of an end-of-term project. In one case, they didn't have far to go, because there is one only walking distance from their school called Care Coitan. Their guide was Terry John, who is the Youth and Schools Liaison Officer for the Pembrokeshire Coast National Parks. He told them how the tombs were made and how they were used. Although today only the uprights and capstone remain, originally there would have been smaller stones fitted together to fill in the gaps. Not all the uprights touched the capstone either. Moving one of these stones may have been the way into the tomb. When someone died, the body was placed on a hillside or a platform, exposed to the forces of nature until nothing but the bleached bones remained. Or sometimes the body was placed in a grave and then later dug up and placed in the tomb. This is an actual tomb, and the bones archaeologists found inside. At first glance it looks like a jumble. But by looking carefully, archaeologists can discover several things. They can tell whether a bone belonged to an adult, a teenager, or a child. A child's leg bones, for example, would be small compared to an adult's. Then, by fitting the bones together, they can see which belonged to the same individual. By doing this, the jumble of bones becomes the parts of many different people. And as you can see, it wasn't always entire skeletons that were placed in the tombs. It's also likely that some bones were removed at a later time perhaps for ceremonies on other sites, or to another family's tomb. Axes, pots, and other important objects were also placed with the bones, or buried at the entrance. We can imagine that fires were burned, and people danced. The next stop was Pentre Ifan, the largest and best preserved chambered tomb in Dyfed. It had once been concealed within a large, long mound.
Fastened together.
Here they saw some of the objects Neolithic people had actually made. They were brought by Nicky Bignell, who lives in Newport and has a keen interest in archaeology. She had been loaned the artifacts from Carmarthen Museum.
Very fine strips of fibre string.
She showed them an axe that would have been fixed into a wooden handle and tied with leather thongs to keep it in place. They learned that there had been factories in the hills not far from where they were sitting. And they saw arrowheads that Neolithic people had made. For although they were farmers, they still did some hunting and fishing, and went to war. They then went to Carrick Samson, a tomb with a polygonal, a many-sided chamber. They could see how it had been made with two different kinds of
Probably took
stone,
several men to pull it
one
out of
rough
the way.
and one smooth.
Do you notice that they used
And they talked
two
about
different
how it
types
was
of
actually
stone? I think you
built.
said that, didn't you?
The site had to be made level, using picks and shovels made of bone and antler. And the stones had to be chosen, special stones, just the right shape and size. Then they were levered onto a sledge which moved on rollers. The stone was tied with ropes made of strips of leather plaited together. Some people pushed and some pulled. Others moved the rollers from the back to the front until they reached the site. Holes were dug, just the right size and shape, so that the stones would fit upright in them. Then the capstone had to be put in place. With the uprights set, a mound was built over the sides so that the capstone could be positioned. These monuments were another way for a community to say, "This is our place."
That's about 4,000 to 5,000 years old.
It held the bones of their ancestors, who had probably farmed the same land.
Spring, early summer perhaps would be the best
And
time.
covered
When
with
the
a
ground is
mound,
firmer, there's less rain, and it's
it could
easier to
probably
move
be
these
seen by other people,
places.
many miles away. The last stop was up a mountainside in Llanwnder. This tomb was slightly different,
Sitting on the rock there.
because the capstone was fitted into the
The
hillside,
yellow remains in there.
and the
And
uprights
this
were
one has
only at
been
the front.
excavated. And when it was, they found
When this
some
tomb was
broken
made,
pottery,
people were burning the
some
bones
ashes and some stones.
and
They
putting the
excavated,
cinders
they
into the
dug all
chamber.
the stuff out, and they found some pottery.
They
and some
put
burnt,
other things in as well.
and it was probably holed up
This one
here
held
in
smooth
the same
stones
way
and bits of
as
pottery,
the other ones were
along with the
meant to be done
charcoal.
at Abercastle. But this time,
Back in the classroom, the pupils thought about how levers could be used to move a big load,
This is a concrete
and how a
step
capstone might have been put in place
to my house.
using levers and ropes. They made a model of a chambered tomb, the uprights covered with earth, and the capstone on a sledge. With a capstone on top of the mound, a trench could be dug to remove the timbers. Then if the sledge was slightly smaller than the capstone, the stone would drop down onto the uprights to form the chamber. But moving a model of a capstone is one thing. They wanted to know how much a capstone really weighs. So they decided to find the weight of the capstone of Carreg Coetan. They could see that the capstone at one end was roughly the shape of a triangle.
Going right down to nothing in the back.
And they could think of the capstone as a series of smaller and smaller triangles. To work out the volume of the stone, they would need to calculate the area of several of these triangles. Add them together to find the total area, and divide that number by the number of triangles to get the average area. Then they would take the average area and multiply it by the length to arrive at the volume of the capstone. To get the measurements, one student had to climb on the top of the burial chamber. At any other time, this would not be allowed. They measured the sides of 6 triangles, 50 centimeters apart. 2 other students measured the length, and the others recorded the measurements. The volume of the capstone was 2 cubic meters. Back in the classroom, they used that figure to calculate the weight of the capstone. To do this, they took a smaller piece of stone, like the one that the capstone was made of, and found its weight in 2 ways. The first was in milliliters. They dropped the stone into water and measured the amount spilled out of the container. This is another way of saying how much space the stone takes up. In other words, its volume.
How much do you think it was? How many cc's?
The volume of the small stone was 194 milliliters. The second method was to weigh the stone,
194, you happy? Yeah?
and they found it weighed 600 grams.
Now,
With these 3 measurements, can you find the weight of the capstone?
how many you got it?
The capstone weighed over 6,000 kilograms.
Wait so much.
That's about as much as this lorry weighs. Fill the lorry, and you have the weight of the capstone at Pentre Ifan.
Pentre Ifan, an age ago, 4,000 years, since Neolithic man did sweat to build a monument. In many a place they stood, large stones. They travelled far to find the rock to cap it all. These massive stones a chamber formed, and earth around rose high to cover all. This cromlech then, at festive times, would open out its heart and then take in to keep for evermore bones. Centuries of storms, wild winds and weather did take away the mound of earth and soil around. Now stands the skeleton, proud, tall, sturdy Pentre Ifan, defies all, defends the Newport Nevern Valley. Walk through, my friend, and enter the paradise we live in,